The silence that hung over the Flemish fields in those pre-dawn minutes was not merely an absence of sound, but a physically palpable phenomenon, heavy and viscous, like the mist rising from the damp earth. It was June 7, 1917. In London, hundreds of kilometers from the front line, Prime Minister Lloyd George was awake in his room on Downing Street, awaiting a signal that was poised to change the very understanding of war. In Dublin, a student preparing for exams looked up from his book, feeling a strange vibration in the window pane, though there was no wind outside. The world was frozen at a point of fragile equilibrium, ready to plunge into an abyss that the human mind was not yet capable of fully comprehending. For long months, the Western Front resembled an unhealing wound on the body of Europe, where two colossal forces were locked in a deadly embrace, unable to loosen their grip or gain the upper hand. The Messina Ridge, towering over the marshy lowlands, served as a natural fortress for the German army. From this height, as if from the balcony of a grand theater, German observers saw every movement of British troops, every supply delivery, every changing of the guard. This strategic advantage turned the lives of the Allies below into a constant expectation of the inevitable artillery strike. Any attempt at assault choked in the mud and machine gun fire, turning into a senseless waste of resources and human lives. It seemed that geography itself sided with the defenders, and breaking this situation with traditional methods of infantry attacks was impossible. However, the war, which had dragged on for 3 years, forced military strategists to look for solutions where no one had looked before. If the enemy cannot be thrown from the top of the hill, then the hill itself must be destroyed. This thought, terrifying in its simplicity and grandeur, originated in the minds of engineers and geologists dressed in military uniforms. General Herbert Plumer, a man with the appearance of a good-natured elderly official, but with a mind as cold and calculating as a chronometer, approved a plan that, in its audacity, surpassed everything known in military history. He decided to shift the war from the horizontal plane to the vertical, descending deep underground to where the roots of ancient trees intertwined with layers of blue clay. Preparation for this event was carried out in strict secrecy, the scale of which is astounding even a century later. This was not merely a military operation, but a gigantic industrial project implemented in front-line conditions. 22 shafts began their descent deep into Belgian soil. The men, who were called moles, worked in inhumane conditions, digging tunnels beneath enemy positions. These were not ordinary soldiers, but former miners from Wales and northern England, accustomed to darkness and stale air. They gnawed into the rock almost silently, using special excavation methods so that no sound would betray their presence to the enemy's sensitive acoustic devices. The German side undoubtedly suspected something was amiss. Officers reported strange noises, a slight trembling of the earth, and how the water in glasses on tables in dugouts would sometimes ripple faintly. German engineers, professionals of the highest caliber, began digging counter-tunnels, attempting to seize the initiative. A silent and terrifying duel unfolded underground, where any superfluous pickaxe strike was considered a mistake. Sometimes, tunnelers would collide with each other in narrow corridors, and then short, furious clashes would erupt in the darkness, their outcome decided by knives and sapper shovels. But most often, British sappers managed to deceive the enemy's vigilance, going deeper and deeper, right beneath the foundations of the German fortifications. By the beginning of summer 1917, over 450,000 kilograms of explosives had been laid beneath the Messina Ridge. This was ammonal, a mixture possessing monstrous destructive power. The charges were placed in 19 huge chambers, positioned to cover the entire front of the attack. Never before had humanity concentrated so much explosive material in one place, with the sole purpose of instantly altering the landscape. This was a triumph of the industrial age, which had put its achievements at the service of destruction. The outer layer of this conflict was obvious: a struggle for the dominant height, for control over the Ypres salient sector. But beneath this layer lay a much deeper internal conflict. For General Plumer, this was a test of his limited objectives doctrine. He did not believe in cavalry charges and the romance of bayonet fighting. His method was mathematics, logistics, and meticulous planning. He wanted to prove that victory could be won not by the number of men thrown into attack, but by the quantity of shells expended and the precision of calculations. His opponent, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, was in a difficult psychological trap. He received reports of underground activity, but to retreat from the Messina Ridge would mean admitting weakness and surrendering a key position without a fight. Pride and military honor, these archaic concepts, came into conflict with the cold reality of the new war. Ruprecht knew he was sitting on a volcano, but the code of honor did not allow him to leave this volcano before the eruption began. Even deeper lay the ideological conflict. The Battle of Messines became a watershed between the old world, where war was a matter of bravery and personal skill, and the new world, where man was transformed into an insignificant detail of a vast mechanism. Here, on these fields, the Romantic era finally died. French observers, present during the preparations, watched the British approach with horror and admiration. France, bled white by years of the Verdun meat grinder, was looking for a way to save its people. Russia, torn by internal contradictions and revolutionary sentiments, closely followed how the Western allies were transitioning to a war of machines. For Russian generals, accustomed to relying on the steadfastness of infantry, the experience of Messines was a signal. Bravery is no longer the decisive factor. The one with better engineers and more powerful factories decides. The night before the attack was filled with surreal anticipation. British artillery, which had been conducting methodical shelling until then, suddenly fell silent. This was part of the plan. The silence was meant to lull vigilance, to make the defenders believe that the assault was postponed or moved to another sector. In the trenches, soldiers of the 2nd British Army checked their equipment, trying not to jingle their ammunition. Among them were Australians and New Zealanders, people from the other side of the world who had come to die for the Empire in foreign mud. Their faces were smeared with soot, their eyes gleamed feverishly. They knew that they faced not just an attack, but a walk through hell that would open up in a few hours. On the German side, there was nervous tension. Flares illuminated no man's land, snatching twisted tree trunks and craters filled with putrid water from the darkness. Sentries peered into the darkness until their eyes ached, trying to catch movement. But the enemy did not come. The ground beneath their feet seemed reliable and firm, an age-old support that could not fail. None of the ordinary soldiers knew that beneath their feet, at a depth of 30 meters, a clockwork mechanism was ticking, counting down the last moments of the customary world. At exactly 3 hours and 10 minutes in the morning, the sky cracked open. This was not like a usual explosion. Witnesses described it as the earth itself revolting. Giant columns of fire mixed with soil, concrete, and debris from fortifications shot skyward, obscuring the stars. 19 mines detonated almost simultaneously. The sound came with a delay, but when it reached the ears, it was a roar that burst eardrums and caused people to lose their orientation in space. The shockwave rolled across the ground, knocking down even those who were several kilometers from the epicenter. This moment marked a point of irreversible transformation. In 1 second, the most powerful line of defense, which the Germans had fortified for 2 years, simply ceased to exist. It was not breached, it was evaporated. Instead of trenches, dugouts, and machine gun nests, giant craters formed, some of which reached 100 meters in diameter. The psychological effect was devastating. Those who survived within the blast radius were so shell-shocked and demoralized that they could not offer resistance. They wandered among the lunar landscape like shadows, not understanding whether they were alive or had already passed into another world. But the explosion was only a prelude. Immediately following it was artillery fire of such density and coordination as the world had never seen. More than 2,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. This was a creeping barrage, a wall of explosions that moved forward in front of the advancing infantry with the precision of a metronome. The artillerymen did not see their targets. They worked from maps and calculations, trusting mathematics more than their eyes. Shells fell 100 meters in front of their own soldiers, creating a protective screen behind which assault groups advanced. The British infantry, rising to the attack, saw not an enemy but chaos before them. They moved through clouds of dust and smoke so thick that it seemed as if night had fallen. But it was not night, but the artificial twilight of war. The soldiers were armed not only with rifles, but also with a new understanding of tactics. They did not run in dense chains, as in 14, exposing themselves to machine guns. They moved in small groups, using the terrain's folds, covering each other with fire from Lewis light machine guns, and suppressing remaining resistance with grenades. The German army, famous for its discipline and resilience, found itself in a situation of complete command collapse. Communication was destroyed. Commanders lost contact with units. Reserves, which tried to advance to the front line, fell under a hurricane of artillery fire which, thanks to aerial correction, knew about enemy movements better than the Germans themselves. This was a triumph of information and coordination. For the first time in the history of war, the interaction of different branches of service reached such a level that artillery, infantry, aviation, and engineers acted as a single organism, controlled by an invisible hand from headquarters. One of the most striking aspects of this offensive was the use of tanks. These clumsy iron monsters, which until recently had caused skepticism among many generals, now crawled behind the infantry, crushing barbed wire and suppressing surviving strongpoints with fire. For German soldiers, the appearance of tanks was the final blow to their psyche. The sight of steel boxes, spewing flames and impervious to rifle fire, caused primal terror. It was a clash of man and machine, and man was losing. By midday, a goal that had seemed unattainable for 2 years was achieved. The Messina Ridge fell under Allied control. The success was staggering. The attackers' losses were significantly lower than predicted, which was an anomaly for the First World War. Usually, every meter of land had to be paid for with thousands of lives. But here, thanks to meticulous preparation and the use of science, the most valuable asset, soldier resources, was preserved. Plumer proved that war could be rational if approached as an engineering problem. However, behind this triumph lay a dark irony. The brilliant victory at Messina became the prologue to one of the war's most terrible tragedies, the Battle of Passchendaele. The command's confidence that the key to a breakthrough had now been found led to the decision to continue the offensive under much less favorable conditions, when autumn rains began, turning the fields of Flanders into an impassable swamp. Messina showed that geography could be conquered with explosives, but climate could not. This lesson was learned too late. The events of that June morning echoed across Europe. In France, where the army was on the verge of mutiny due to senseless losses, the news from Messines was met with cautious hope. It turned out that it was possible to advance without drowning the enemy in bodies. This gave the French command, and General Pétain in particular, an argument for restoring discipline. Quote, "Zero," he said, implying that future battles would be technological, not sacrificial. In Russia, where the provisional government was trying to hold the front and inspire soldiers to continue the war, the Messines experience was analyzed with great interest. Russian military theorists saw in it confirmation of the need for modernization. But Russia's tragedy was that it no longer had time for this modernization. Industry could not provide the front with such a quantity of shells and equipment, and the social fabric of society was already tearing at the seams. For the Russian soldier, sitting in a trench without boots and often without ammunition, stories of British mines and tanks sounded like a fairy tale from another world, emphasizing the technological gap between the Eastern and Western fronts. Poland, whose territory was divided between the warring empires, watched these events through the prism of hope for its own rebirth. Poles fought on both sides of the front, and for them, the improvement of war methods meant only one thing: the approaching end of the nightmare and the possibility of restoring statehood on the ruins of collapsed empires. The technological leap demonstrated at Messines showed that the old monarchies were not capable of adapting to the new reality as quickly as democratic or industrially developed nations. The climax of the battle arrived not at the moment the trenches were captured, but at the moment the enemy realized the futility of resistance. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered, stunned not so much by the fact of defeat as by the manner in which it was inflicted. They were prepared to fight men, but not geological cataclysms. In their eyes, the question was readable: if the enemy can blow up mountains, what else can he do? This was a breaking of will that surpassed physical damage in its significance. Prisoners, passing by the gigantic craters, turned away, unable to look at the place where their comrades had stood just yesterday. One of the most important, yet often overlooked aspects of the Battle of Messines was the role of logistics and the rear. To ensure such intensity of fire and demolition work required the efforts of thousands of people who never saw the enemy face to face. Railway workers, truck drivers, factory workers, all of them were part of this victory. War had finally become total. Success at the front was forged in the workshops of Manchester and Sheffield. This understanding began to penetrate the minds of politicians and strategists. The economy that could produce more explosives and deliver them to the right place at the right time would win. Paradoxically, it was the success at Messines that demonstrated the dead end of trench warfare. Even such a grand effort, whose preparation took almost 2 years, led only to a local tactical success. The front was shifted by several kilometers, but the strategic breakthrough that would have led to the end of the war did not occur. Germany did not capitulate. Its army retreated to new positions and continued to resist. This became a bitter lesson for optimists who believed that one, albeit brilliantly planned, battle could decide the outcome of a world conflict. War had turned into a process of attrition of resources, where victory went to whoever was the last to collapse from exhaustion. The resonance of the events of June 7th extends far beyond the 20th century. Messines became a harbinger of an era of man-made technological disasters. The craters left by the explosions still exist. The most famous of them, Lone Tree Crater, or Pool of Peace, is now filled with water. It is a quiet, idyllic place, surrounded by greenery, where tourists visit. Looking at the calm surface of the water, it is hard to imagine that this pit is a scar from a wound inflicted upon the planet by human ingenuity. It is a monument not only to the fallen, but also to the very idea that intellect and science, devoid of ethical breaks, can become the most terrible weapon. The lessons of Messines are relevant even today, as we observe the development of military technologies, drones, cyber attacks, high-precision weapons. All these are direct descendants of the philosophy that was born on the fields of Flanders. The idea that one can wage a contactless war, minimizing losses of one's own soldiers through technical superiority, originated precisely there, in the tunnels beneath Messines. But then, as now, this idea often proves to be an illusion. Technologies change, but the essence of war remains the same. It is chaos, suffering, and the unpredictability of the human factor. The battle showed that even the most perfect planning cannot account for everything. For example, one of the mines never exploded at the appointed time due to a detonator malfunction. It lay in the ground for 38 years and detonated only in 1955 during a thunderstorm, fortunately killing only one cow. This is a reminder that the echo of war can resonate for decades after peace treaties are signed. The earth remembers everything, and _0_ charges of hatred can go off at the most unexpected moment. In the context of the development of military thought, Messines became a turning point in the transition from linear tactics to deep operation tactics. The coordination of artillery with infantry, the use of smoke screens, night attacks, all these elements became standard for the armies of the 20th century. For the Germans, it was a painful lesson on the necessity of echeloned defense. They realized that a rigid front line was vulnerable and switched to the tactic of, "one," allowing the enemy to advance deep, only to then cut off and destroy them with counterattacks. This tactical evolution prolonged the war by another year and a half. Analyzing those events, we see how the attitude towards the soldier changed. If before he was a hero, a warrior, now he became an operator of complex equipment or an element of the landscape that needed to be cleared. Humanism retreated before efficiency. In staff reports, words about valor became rarer, and statistical calculations about ammunition expenditure per square meter of area became more frequent. This depersonalization of war became, perhaps, the most terrible consequence of the industrialization of conflict. However, amidst this triumph of machine over spirit, there remained glimmers of humanity. In the memoirs of the battle's participants, moments of astonishing nobility and compassion have been preserved. Australian medics pulled wounded German soldiers from craters, risking their lives under residual shelling. Enemies, finding themselves in the same infirmary, shared water and tobacco, united by the common horror they had experienced. In the face of the cosmic power of the explosion, national enmity receded into the background, giving way to a sense of shared destiny among small people in the face of history's giant meat grinder. The Battle of Messines also marked a significant milestone in the history of military medicine. The enormous number of shell-shocked individuals, people with psychological traumas, forced doctors to seek new approaches to treating shell shock. While previously such soldiers might have been deemed cowards and court-martialed, the scale of the psychological impact of the explosions at Messines was such that ignoring the problem became impossible. Psychiatry took a step forward, recognizing that the human psyche has a breaking point, and this limit can be easily overcome by modern weaponry. Returning to the silence with which it all began, we realize that it was deceptive. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a taut string. And when the string snapped, the world changed forever. The vibration from the explosion of 19 mines passed through the Earth's crust, but an even more powerful vibration passed through the consciousness of humanity. We learned to move mountains, but not to live in peace with each other. Technical progress outpaced moral development, and this gap is still felt today. Today, walking through the peaceful Belgian fields where farmers grow potatoes and graze cattle, it is hard to believe that tons of unexploded ordnance and the bones of thousands of soldiers, whose names have faded from memory, still lie beneath this land. But Messina Ridge stands as a silent witness. Its shape is altered, its slopes recarved by explosions. But it remembers that night when humans tried to play the role of gods, reshaping creation at their whim. And this ridge reminds us, any victory achieved at the cost of total destruction leaves scars that do not heal for centuries. Ultimately, the story of Messina is not about how one army defeated another. It is a story of how humanity stepped into a new era, where the boundaries of the possible were expanded in the most brutal way. It is a warning that the power of technology demands a responsibility that we often lack. And when we look at modern conflicts, we see the shadows of Messina in every precision strike, in every ruined city, in every soldier who looks to the sky with hope and fear, not knowing what the next minute will bring, dawn or darkness. The bright June morning of 1917, which began with an artificial earthquake, ended with the triumph of British arms, but the sunset of the old world. And in this paradox lies the main lesson. In a war of machines, there are no winners, only survivors. And those who survived Messina carried this truth within them until the end of their days, passing it on to us, their descendants, in the hope that we can wield the power dormant in the depths of matter and the human mind more wisely. The circle has closed. Silence has returned to the fields of Flanders, but now it is the silence of memory, heavy and significant, like the granite of the gravestones standing in rows in the military cemeteries, stretching to the horizon. Ultimately, the story of the Battle of Messina is a story of the limits of human capability and of exceeding those limits. It is about how ordinary people, miners and clerks, farmers and laborers, were thrust into circumstances demanding superhuman effort, and how they met that challenge, paying an unimaginable price. Their experience, solidified in the concrete of bunkers and in the water of craters, remains an eternal monument to resilience and tragedy, a lesson we are obliged to learn so that changing geography is never again achieved at the cost of destroying humanity. And when we look at modern conflicts, where drones and artificial intelligence are changing combat tactics, we see a direct line of continuity stretching from those first tanks and that first coordinated artillery, reminding us that the tools change, but the essence of war remains immutable. It is always a tragedy played out by living people. Silence returns, completing the circle. Just as on that night before the attack, the world falls silent. But now we know what can follow that silence. This knowledge, heavy and bitter, is perhaps the most valuable trophy brought back from the fields of Messina, a trophy we must cherish and pass on to future generations, so that the echo of that explosion serves not as a call to a new battle, but as a signal to preserve peace.